So to start everything off, we wanted to give you guys an example. You're asked to stay at home to reduce the spread of the coronavirus. What do you think about the action? Do you think this is a good thing for you or a bad thing? What do you think others will think? Will they think positively of you, that you're doing the right thing, or will they think that you're doing the wrong thing? And eventually, how likely is this action going to happen that you'll actually stay home based off of everything else? And then eventually, will you actually do it? Will you stay home or will you not? The example we just gave you was a good model for the theory of reasoned action. So our initial question that we asked was, what will you think of it? And that's your attitude. What do you think of the action? Do you see it positively or negatively? And then our second question that we asked was, what will others think? So that's a subjective norm. And those could be positive or negative reinforcements based off of what other people will think of you if you do that action. And then that led us into our behavior intention. So that's the likelihood of actually performing that behavior and how likely it is that you'll do it. And then when we asked, will you decide to actually act on it? That's your volitional behavior. So that's your ultimate decision to take the action.
So our article defines the theory of reasoned action as this. Right, it's the best predictor of volatile behavior is the intention in which we have. So the ways in which people tell what we're going to do, or the ways in which we act on something is the intention that we have towards it, right? So there are two factors that go into intention, or two factors that go into the theory of reasoned action, or one of which is attitude towards behavior, and we measure that by behavioral beliefs times evaluation of beliefs. So what you believe and the behavior that you have, as well as the ways in which you break that down and the ways in which you see that. And then you have subjective norms, which also means that the normative beliefs, or it's the normative beliefs times the motivation to comply with those beliefs. So what everybody else thinks around you, what the norm is, times or along with what the motivation is for you to comply. What motivations are they giving you to act towards that? So the strengths that go along with this kind of theory, one is that it's practical, it's easy to use, it makes sense in regards to that, and it predicts and explains what's coming next, right? So it's a predictor. We can figure it out, and it allows us to see what somebody might do, right? Part of the weaknesses that go along with that, though, often people think that there should be more components, right? Do we want to build off of something other than just attitude and norms, or beliefs and norms? So should we see something else, or are those two things okay? There are measurement issues to go along with that. Obviously, you have to ask questions, and people may or may not give you an accurate answer. So to try to measure somebody's beliefs, or to try to measure how they view what's going on around them is a very difficult thing. And you also have to measure intention. So though there is a very kind of stable definition for what intention is, or what the best predictor of volatile behavior is, you have to decide what somebody's intention is in regards to the subject. So the idea of diet and the premise of diet is a little bit too broad of a topic to try to break down. It comes with too many different contingencies, and so they tried to think about something that all Americans had consumed at one point or another. One of those happened to be milk, right? Whether it be from the womb or in the food that we eat now, in the cereal or whatever, people consume milk on a regular basis. So the 1% or Less campaign had three interventions, right? One was paid advertising, one was public relations, and one was education, right? And in those paid advertisements, in the public relation realms and in the education settings, there were messages that they wanted to get across. One of those messages was that low-fat milk is healthier than high-fat milk. Another one was that low-fat milk is not as expensive, or is not expensive compared to high-fat milk. So it's not something that people should worry about in regards to paying. And low-fat milk tastes just as good as high-fat milk. So it tastes the same, and people shouldn't worry about there being a diluted taste. So they came up with a couple of hypotheses to go along with those messages, to go along with those statements in regards to the test that they gave. One of which was that an exposure to campaign messages would cause increases in intentions and attitudes to switch from whole milk to low-fat milk. So maybe people would change their minds in regards to that. And that increases on behavioral beliefs, there would be an increase there, but there wouldn't be one in regards to the normative beliefs. So those of family, community, physicians, people wouldn't necessarily change their mind in regards to that, but they would change their behavior.
So the outcomes or results and findings that the article had were two main takeaways. So the first one was that interventions focused on certain specific behaviors were found more likely to succeed. And then second of all, the theory of reasoned action can be used to actually create message-based interventions. The researchers in this study found that campaign messages that focused on switching behavior changed at specific targeted behavioral beliefs, enabled you to then change intentions and then change behavior. So focusing on specific behaviors produce significant public health effects, such as they found that people reported more switching to low-fat milks, and supermarkets showed increases of low-fat milk sales. Another thing that they found was that paid advertising combined with public relations actually produced the strongest effects as well. So here's another relatable example that you can apply the theory of reasoned action to. So let's say that there are tons of advertisements promoting that hand sanitizer kills 99.9% of germs, and then all over the news we're seeing the advocating for the use of using hand sanitizer and that it's sold out and that everyone wants it. And kind of like our article had found in the results, they had said that combining public relations and paid advertisements really was a huge thing to get people to act on stuff. So what would you think of this if you saw this? Like, how would you perceive it? What do you think others would think of you if you use hand sanitizer? What would you be most likely to do? And what would you eventually do? I know that I went and looked for hand sanitizer. So just take a minute to think, what have you guys been doing? What did you do? What would you do in this scenario? The next article we decided to take a look into was some research that was done on the theory of reasonable action to predict sexual behavior among teenagers. So their hypothesis was that sexual intercourse would be related to intentions to have sex, and then general attitude towards the intercourse, and then general norms. So they would all be related together. So the study was conducted over a 7-year period. They surveyed 749 teenage students. They started from when they were in elementary school and talked to them every year all the way up until around junior, senior year. So for every year, they would have 21 different focus groups with the same sex. So it would be boys with boys and girls with girls. And then they would just ask them open-ended questions regarding their sexual behavior intentions, a general attitude, general norms, outcome beliefs, and then normative beliefs. And then also yearly, they would do individual questionnaires regarding their own personal intentions and their own personal experience. So the results found that by year 7, 44% of the group had actually had sexual intercourse. Most teenagers had a positive attitude towards sexual intercourse despite all of the consequences of having sex. There were 2 types of social norms they found. It was through adult perspective and through a youth perspective. So the perception and the social norms that all of their peers and the younger people had weighted greater over that of what adults thought of sexual intercourse. So to teenagers, their subjective norms or what others thought, it was more important what their peers thought, what other kids were thinking. And then the study also found that family and socioeconomic status norms played the largest role because, even though your peers might have this huge weight on you, your family ultimately decides like what neighborhood you're going to be in, what school district you go to, and that kind of forms around this whole idea of what peers you will actually have. So even though teenagers cared more about what their peers thought, in all, it was really the family perspective that kind of had the greatest weight on everything, which was interesting.
In introducing another scenario, let's say that there's a campus-wide Sleep to Reap campaign, right, which encourages self-care. So some of the things that they're telling you is that your grades will get better if you sleep a little bit more, you'll feel better, all these kinds of things, right? So some neurologists are coming to class every week to try to nail this point home. Your teachers and professors are talking about it. T-shirts are being given on campus to promote sleep and healthy sleep patterns. And we want to know if this is something that would actually affect your sleep and study habits. Would this change the ways in which you view it? So how do you measure sleep as important, or do you measure sleep as something that's important to get? What do you think your friends would think if they're like, yo, I want to go to the club, or I want to go out tonight, or I want to hang out with you, go to a basketball game, and you're like, nah, I got to get some rest because I have to study in the morning, or whatever. Do you think your friends would say that that's something that's interesting, or do you think that you would try to yield the perspective of the physician, right? Or finally, do you feel like you would sleep more? Like, is this something that would actually change the patterns that you have? And would you take the time to compress the rest of your day to get some rest? To round out that scenario, my article has to do with women, Iranian women with type 2 diabetes, and the ways in which they take care of themselves, right? So again, self-care. So to give a background on type 2 diabetes, 90 to 95% of people diagnosed with diabetes have this form. And what it does to the body is create an inability of muscle cells to respond to insulin. And there's not a compensation for that. So not only are you not breaking down the insulin, but your body's not compensating for the insulin that you're not getting. So the objective of this study is to increase self-care behaviors in those diabetic patients, right? So an example of self-care was to take care of your feet, to wash your feet, to make sure that everything was okay, right? Because it takes a toll on your body, and a large part of that, from what I've seen in my family, is something that has to do with your feet, right? And the ways in which you're comfortable and the ways in which you walk. So it's a semi-experimental study. 100 patients out of the 170 were studied or experimented on, which is to say that they started with 170 people. 35 of them dropped out. 35 of them said, I didn't want to do it. And then the other 35 were kind of given a pass. They didn't have to do it. They chose another group of people. But there had to be a criteria, right? So you had to have reading and writing skills. You had to have over a year of diagnosis. You had to be over 30, and you couldn't have a mental disorder or a hypertension, right? So those were the things that had to be done for you to get chosen for the study. That's where the 170 came from, and then they broke that down to 100. So 50 people were put in experimental groups, and 50 people were put in control groups, and they did something similar, right? They gave them packets on what to do in regards to their self-care. They took them through classes and courses, the experimental group, to make sure that they were okay, and things of that nature, just to see if the attitudes changed. And there was also a physician there in those classes to see how the attitude was affected, right? So the questionnaire included, so they gave a questionnaire, right? So the questionnaire included things of demographics and attitude and norms and attention and self-efficacy. And they gave this questionnaire, I would assume, to measure the ways in which women acted on that self-care, the ways in which that self-care changed, right? So that's what the questionnaire was for. It was something similar in the study that we have in class. And the outcome, as was similar to what we read, was that an experimental group's attitude increases towards self-care. So the people that were given the classes and the people that were given the pamphlets and the people that sat with the physicians, they had this self-care thing that worked out for them. And because of that belief, there was a growing sense of intent, right? Which is pretty much the theory, which is to say that because the belief changed, intent changed as well, and they decided to act on it. So that was my article. So finally, one of our discussion questions for you was to work outside of the realm of healthcare, right? So we gave you a lot of examples today that had to do with taking care of yourself, that had to do with the healthcare system and the ways in which your ideas and beliefs change in regards to your actions and your intents. But we really wanted to know if you felt like this theory was effective outside of healthcare, and if you do feel like the theory is effective outside of healthcare, how do you feel like it works? So do you think that this is something that we can see outside of people trying to better themselves? Remember, there was an option of volatile behavior. It's kind of in the definition. So really wanted to see or hear your opinions on that. Thank you.
Going off of Douglas, with the theory of reasoned action, there are just so many ways that we can use this to try and develop different methods of change behaviors to apply to so many different things, whether it be healthcare or outside of it. And one thing I was kind of curious about is how can we conduct research on attitude change and behavior change to benefit government initiatives to encourage younger people to maybe develop healthier attitudes towards alcohol, where they're not just binge drinking and risking themselves in such harmful ways. Like, maybe there are different ways that we can use it to change behavior in a good light. So what are some different ways that maybe even different than alcohol that we could do that? And just kind of give me your guys' opinions.